So I'd like to thank everyone for coming this afternoon. As you all know, our institution has been hosting this week the Ability Ally Initiative, which includes both the Ability exhibit that is open in the Black and Gold room. If you haven't had a chance to see that, it's open till 8:30 tonight, and then it'll be open again tomorrow from 8:30 to 2:30. That's free and it is open to the public, so if you want to bring a friend or a family member, please feel free to do that. It will be there. But today we are here to hear Dr. Karen Myers visit with us in regards to the Ability Initiative, and specifically in regards to higher ed and what the American with Disability Act has actually meant. Because if you're not aware, this is the 25th year of the ADA legislation. And so just to give you a brief introduction, Dr. Meyer is an associate professor and the director of the Higher Education Administration Graduate Program at St. Louis University. She has directed their program at St. Louis University and is a co-founder and the director of the award-winning International Disability Education Program, Allies for Inclusion, which includes the Ability Ally exhibit. And I would tell you, so they have taken their training model to India. They have gone to Ghana, they have gone to Spain as well, so really trying to move disability not just within the bounds of the US, which is where disability law originated from, but to also reach other parts of the world. This is a unique traveling exhibit that was designed to promote the inclusion of people with disabilities by demonstrating a respect for others, comfort for interactions, and awareness of disability issues. Dr. Myers has been a collegiate teacher and administrator since 1979. She is a national disability consultant and trainer and has authored numerous publications and continues to teach her self-designed graduate course, Disability in Higher Education and Society. Please help me welcome Dr. Myers to the stage.
Thank you. When I was 4 years old, I became an ally, or at least I think I did. So like many of you, my mom taught me to look both ways when I crossed the street. So when I would be with my mom, I would take her hand and we would cross the street and go to the bus stop. Those are the days when we were going shopping or going to the doctor. And once we got to the bus stop, I would lean forward and look for the right bus because Mom told me there's one that begins with a W and one that begins with a B. We're going to get on the one that begins with the W. Okay, so I looked for that W bus, the Walton bus, and I would say, okay, Mom, it's time, it's coming. And I would take her hand, we'd get on the bus and pay the fare and sit down and go on our way. So what's a little different about that, or maybe some of you probably could picture that scenario, going with your mom, going on a bus, going shopping. But the thing was, I was a 4-year-old and I was the navigator because my mom was legally blind. So what I did at 4 was I believed, well, I didn't know then, but I know now, that I was an ally for my mom. I would make sure that we got on the right bus. I would make sure that, sometimes I would pick out thread or material for my mom because my mom, even though she was legally blind, was a seamstress. Think about that. I wonder if people wondered or thought, I wonder why she's putting green thread on my purple dress. Maybe they were just kind about it and didn't even mention it to her. But I think that's where I came in. So often, I was my mother's eyes. And what's interesting now is that 60 years later, my daughter is my eyes. Doesn't sound grammatically correct, does it? But she is. Because I, too, am legally blind. I now have my mother's eyes. But whether we are on a street in St. Louis, Missouri, or a beach in California where we lived, or going to the Notre Dame or the Metro in Paris, or the Prado in Madrid, my daughter was there, and she was my eyes in those situations, just like I was for my mom. So a little background, though, about my visual disability. Not only is my mom legally blind, but my brother and sister were legally blind as well. And there were only 5 in our family, so I was considered the one with the good eyes. And so Mom would have me do these tasks, such as looking for the right bus, or making sure we got the right cold medicine at the pharmacy down the street, or calling in an order at the grocery store that was then delivered to us. And even though now, after my mom is 92 years old, she was a strong woman then, she's a strong woman now, but I really don't know if she would say that I was an ally. I don't even think she knew that term at the time. She just expected me to do these things with her and for my brother and sister as well. So going back to the visual disability, not only are my brother and sister legally blind and my mother, but also I have 20 people in my family who are, and probably now even more. And it's a hereditary disability. It's now called, what we have discovered is we're one of the only families in the country who has this, and it's called rod cone dystrophy. The one thing about our family, though, you can imagine get-togethers with a bunch of legally blind people, or persons who are legally blind, if we're using person first language. And when we get together, we definitely would talk about funny things we did, what parking meters we said hello to when we thought they were people, many times I've gone in the men's restroom, well, I learned what they look like. And there were those kind of stories that if we didn't have humor in our family, if we didn't tell those kind of stories to each other, I don't know how it would have been. We still joke to this day. Things that may not be so funny is my cousin, who is my age. I should tell you that I was able to get my license at 16. And I was the one, other than my dad. My dad did all the driving in our family, so I was able to drive. And everybody was thrilled because I could take them places. And but then when I was 25, that's when I discovered that I was legally blind, and I kind of backed off from the driving up until that point, and then I did stop when I almost hit one of those, those flag men holding the stop sign on the highway, and you just don't stop, and he was a little worried, and I was too. So I thought, maybe I should not be driving. But, so going back to my family, though, I do have a cousin who is my age, and she continued to drive for years. And we would go to family reunions, and I'd say, I stopped at 25, and I said, you still driving? She'd say, oh, yeah. I have my daughter sitting next to me, and she tells me what's coming. I guess what's coming, when to stop, what color the lights are. I said, really? And then, so, time goes on, and we go to more family reunions. Are you still driving? Yeah, I am, everything's going okay. So years later, now we have grandchildren. I go to another reunion and ask her if she was still driving, and she said, oh, yes. Now my grandson sits next to me and tells me what's coming. No, only the problem is, she said, he'll get mad at me, and he just decides not to say anything. So I said, well, how long is this going to go on? And then she decided, it wasn't worth it. Now, she doesn't live here, so don't worry. I won't even tell you where she lives, but she's not driving anymore, so that's a good thing. But with all the family, it does help us all to have a really good attitude, I think, about disability. And the one thing I will tell you, that we are all at different developmental levels, though. And I ended up going into disability education, and especially when the Americans with Disabilities Act came out, and that's when when it was signed, and I signed up, or I guess I applied for some ADA training through the Department of Justice and the Equal Opportunity Commission, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And that's when I really started being interested in disability education, disability services, and that's where my life took me. Whereas other people in my family decided not to go to college or had different paths, and I think then each of us have discovered where we are and where we are developmentally in our disability identity. I have to put in a plug here, I have a nephew who is now doing a one-man show called Cones. And I have not seen it yet. He lives in Philadelphia, but he is doing the show across the country. So maybe someday, I want to see it definitely, and I think he is going to college campuses too. So Cones, because it is Rod Cone dystrophy, and he tells his story. We all have different ways of accommodating ourselves, and in this case, in my own life, I have learned to use a lot of magnifiers, CCTVs, which magnify print. My computer screens are very large. I use high contrast. Poor tech people come into my office and they say, "Don't you want me to change this color? And why is it so dark?" And I keep turning down the dark because I'm extremely light sensitive, so turning down the light, I mean, and making it extremely high contrast. And so the other thing here too is that I have all of my notes that I use for class and for speeches are 22-point Arial black. And so that's why I said I have a big binder here of notes, and you may think you're going to be here for hours, but I promise you they're only about 2 words a page, so it'll be pretty quick. I won't make you stay very long. But after not only going back to my mother's eyes, my daughter being my eyes, but I also discovered that I was the voice of my mom. Now, as I said, she's very strong and she has her own voice. Believe me, she has her own voice. But I also became her voice in other situations. And I think that speaking of voice, if we go back to the idea of being a voice, maybe some of you, or all of us, I would say, in one way or another, particularly being educators, are the voice of someone. So whether it is the voice of someone who cannot speak, or is not sure what to say, or does not have a voice for themselves, if we are the voice, then we can become, or maybe we already are, the ally. And scholars tend to tell us that being an ally requires action and advocacy and practice. And I know some of you maybe were at some of our ally workshops already, and the one thing that we do focus on is action, putting it into action, however we can advocate for people, moving forward with action. But then also I like the idea of practice, because I think we can act, and maybe we can act once, but practicing it over and over and taking our work, our alliness, and, oh, that's a new word, alliness, and taking it and using it wherever you are or whomever you're with. Another thing we talk about is that Dr. Nancy Evans, who is a scholar in our field in student affairs and higher education, she talks about being an ally and having knowledge acquisition, obviously knowing what we're doing, learning about disability, immersion into the community, and then a lot of trial and error. So when we go back to the word practice, we may not always do it right. And people worry too about, I've given presentations where they're saying, well, I even called one, is it okay to say that? So people are concerned, what should I say, what should I do? I don't know, I don't want to offend anyone, and that's fine. I think it is through trial and error that we learn to become an ally. And so that's our whole goal in Allies for Inclusion, the Ability Exhibit, and through the workshops that we do. Now, as I've said we've been here for 2 days. We're going to be here for another day, and maybe some of you have heard some of these same lines coming out, but there is one thing I always do in my presentations, and is ask 2 questions. And that is, 1, do you know someone with a disability? And I won't ask you to call out, but I would like you to think about that. Who do you know with a disability? Some of us, when we think about that, a person may not come to mind, because sometimes when we think of disability, we think of the accessible symbol for disability, the wheelchair, right? And so we're thinking of people who have mobility disabilities, but the law defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So what is a major life activity? So if major life activity is more than mobility, which that is 1, walking, but then we have all the other things: seeing, hearing, breathing, speaking, learning, and on and on. So there are many types of disabilities. The other question, I do want you to also think that when you are thinking of your person, if you could think about it through this presentation and apply what we have, what you hear when we're talking about language and being an ally to that person, because I think the more personal we can make it, the better. It's another thing I learned in my classes. I teach the disability and higher education class that I developed for master's students and doctorate students, and it's required in our master's program for student personnel administration at St. Louis University. And so we'll have a lot of conversations about who knows people with disabilities. And one thing that I have them do is go out and interview a person with a disability. Originally, when I was teaching this class, I did a lot of, 1, I had the students read a lot. 2, I have them listen to me a lot, and maybe watch some videos. But then I've decided that the closer we can get to people with disabilities and learn about them and talk to them and learn their stories, that is the better it will be for all of us. So I have my students do an interview with a person with a disability, and that has really been successful. And one thing, though, that the students often say is, I've talked to the person, it was my mom or my dad or my brother or a friend, and the person said, I don't have a disability. But the person, I have one example, my student said, yeah, my mom has 1 arm, but I never thought of her as having a disability. And another one said, my dad has post-traumatic stress disorder. I never thought of that as a disability. So, and then when they were talking to the people, they learned that sometimes people don't see themselves as having a disability. So that can be positive and negative. If they are, the one thing is that by acknowledging, well, even if you don't acknowledge, but you are protected by the law, definitely by the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and but also with our college students, for example, they need to self-disclose in order to receive accommodations. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that sometimes unless people do disclose, they don't realize that they might be covered under the law and that they would be protected from discrimination. The other question I like to ask is, have you excluded anyone today? And I ask that question because I think when I have reversed it and I've said, well, have you included everyone today or yesterday or this week? Most people will say, sure, I sure tried to include people. I don't do it on purpose. I don't do it intentionally to exclude people. But if we actually think, have we excluded? Is there anything we have done personally or in our programs, our services, our classes, our curriculum, buildings? Is there anything on our campus that has cause someone to be excluded. So keeping that in mind as well throughout the presentation will, I think, is a good idea as we continue. So the other thing I was thinking too about when we're thinking about people with disabilities and who is covered under the law, or maybe people who you know, also I'm just going to give you a little list, and maybe you can think about some of these people. Someone who is hard of hearing, or someone who has low vision, or who has had a stroke, diabetes, heart, lung, or liver, kidney disease, one arm or one leg, missing fingers, cancer, anxiety, depression, anorexia, attention deficit disorder, autism, excuse me, on the autism spectrum, or as I said earlier, post-traumatic stress disorder. That broadens the definition. And by thinking of that span of people and who is covered and who are our colleagues, who are our friends with disabilities, will, again, keep us in tune. And then as we think about allies, are we being allies for those people? It's been 25 years since the ADA was passed. So what has changed in the past 25 years in the world of disability? The ADA was signed into law July 26, 1990, and it was landmark civil rights legislation that strengthened the inclusion of people with disabilities at work, school, and community. Its goals promote equal opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency of people with disabilities. So as many of you know, the titles of the ADA that protect people with disabilities are in the areas of employment, state and local government, public accommodations and commercial facilities, and telecommunications. People are protected in all of those areas. So in 1990, when I remember first starting all of the training and listening to people teach me more about disability, there were 45 million people with disabilities in the country. Today, there are 57 million people, and 11% of college students have disabilities, though we know that there are probably many more than that. And there are people who do not self-disclose, and so there are many more, and it depends where you look for these figures as well. But looking at that number and the increase of the people who have disclosed disability and who are receiving accommodations, or people who should not be discriminated against because of disability, it's interesting to think about the changes then you have seen and I have seen in the last 25 years. Think about your person. What changes have occurred over the last 25 years? And that is, maybe some of you are thinking of someone who is a baby or who is 5, and that's something that they haven't been around as long to experience the law. But think, if you can think, if you're old enough, I can't see you, so you must know you all look great and you all look really young. So if you, yeah, you've got one thing going for you there. I know there are bodies out there, but I really can't see you. So, but I was leading somewhere with that. Where was I going? Oh, yes. So if you think about your person, though, and if you have been around for 25 years, if you can remember when the ADA was passed, or maybe you read about it in a history book, and you can also think, what has happened over the last 25 years in your person's life, the person you're thinking about? So one thing I think that has changed is the physical access to streets and buildings and facilities, restrooms, events. If you think about all those changes, so the Americans with Disabilities Act has guidelines, and so the nice thing about the Americans with Disabilities Act is that the guidelines, the ADA ADAG, I have to say that. Okay, the Accessibility Guidelines, ADAAG, came out at the same time as the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. So that's a good thing, because back with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the actual specifications didn't come out until 1977. So there's a big lapse there in the time a law is passed and the time that the specifications came out. And then, were there people going around making sure we did all of these things, that we complied? Well, there aren't disability police running around, I will say that. So, but we have, many of us have been trained, and universities were responsible for making those changes, along with the public accommodations, the commercial facilities, state and local government, and in employment, as I said. So physical access, that's something that most of us notice. All of a sudden, we started to see accessible doors, automatic doors. We saw curb cuts. We saw what other kinds of access on streets, facilities in buildings, elevators in buildings. And then those elevators might have had large buttons, and they might have talked to you. I like those. I like those that talk to you. So those kind of facilities, restrooms, we all of a sudden had to make larger stalls and make sure that at least one of the stalls were accessible in a restroom. How many restrooms have you seen that the soap dispenser or the towel dispenser is still high, but the sink is low? We talked about that today in our session, in the Ability Ally session. You know what, before I go on, were any of you, and you have to do this by applause because I can't see you, so how many of you were in one of the workshops in the last 2 days? Okay, great. See, you could be saying this. Okay, this is good though, because you can be thinking about your access hunt, right? And so in the access hunt, did we find restrooms? Hopefully not on this campus, right? I found that this is a very, not only friendly people, but it is an accessible campus. But I know in my own campus, in my own building, I discovered that, you know, even though we had the disability stall in the restroom, we still had the soap dispenser and the paper towel dispenser were too high. And so those are things that for some reason it just didn't get taken care of. And if someone doesn't notice it to change it, then it doesn't get changed, and then someone is excluded from that restroom, right? Or at least they went to the restroom and they weren't able to wash their hands. So, but we won't go there. That's another story. But it has to do with a person's health and safety. Signage is another thing. On your access hunt, you found signage. The signage here is amazing in this building. I noticed, and actually I was over at your administration building too, and it was very easy to find. So you have good signage, but some places don't so much, right? And it should be the Braille and the raised lettering signage, the high contrast signage. And according to the law, it needs to be at a certain height, and there are very specific rules for that. So that's something that I think definitely has changed. Signage as well as physical access. Another thing is transportation. Have you seen changes in transportation? Definitely buses, trains, metro, planes, all with accessible. The only thing, again, is accessible restrooms on planes. But that's another thing that I think you might find some, but there are still places that need some work. But those things definitely have changed. And there are lifts on buses and in trains and in the metro. So I think that has changed. Another thing that was on the access hunt was parking. And we were looking at how many parking spaces are accessible. And so 1 in 25, according to the rule, needs to be an accessible space. Do we have that? You can check it out. I think around here, people felt that it was accessible. And then out of 400, 8 spaces need to be accessible, and 2 of those need to be van accessible. So are we doing that? But again, it has changed. It wasn't that way 25 years ago. And now people do have access to parking. Menus. Have you gone into restaurants? Have you noticed the change in the menu, not only the menus on boards, that they have become, hopefully, more readable, and we've been talking in our sessions about universal design and what that font looks like and what that spacing and contrast looks like. And so is it readable? And that has improved. And another thing that I've noticed being legally blind is that there have been more menus that are large print and that are in Braille. At the beginning, I used to go around and ask for large print menus and Braille menus. And one of the best places for that was Cracker Barrel. Do you have Cracker Barrel? Yeah, okay. Cracker Barrel, I could ask for the large print menu. Now, most of the time they couldn't find it. It was in a box underneath the podium, but I said, just dig around. You'll find it, you'll find it. Sometimes places will have a sign and say, we offer a Braille menu, which if one is totally blind, that sign's really helpful. But you have to think about it. Just think it through. Yeah, okay, but if you're with someone and they can say they have a Braille menu for you, and then you can ask. But most people who are blind definitely we ask. And I think that's a good thing, or people learn to ask. And that's another thing that I believe the Americans with Disabilities Act has done, has given us power and empowered us to have a voice and to ask questions. And so if those menus are available, it's okay to ask. I've had people read menus to me before in restaurants because I could not see the print on the menu. But this is another thing I've noticed lately, even in new restaurants. Sometimes that the font is I feel like it's going backwards a little bit. People want to be have it be so pretty that it's difficult to read. So just something to think about if you're ever creating a menu, for those of you who are owning your own restaurants. Communication is another thing that has changed. Through phone, television, computers, technology. With phones, it is required now to have a relay system, and what people used to use is TT-WISE. I always forget what it stands for. What's the Y? I'm trying to think what the Y is. But it is text telephone for the deaf, and then there would be a relay system where you did not have to use a certain device, but the relay system was built in for people who had speech disabilities or hearing disabilities, and there would be a person in between. So that's very helpful. Again, that changed with the ADA. And all of these things, too, that I'm talking about, this definitely can relate to colleges and universities as well. But as the community changes, the universities change. Sometimes the university will be the first to change. What's interesting about the ADA is that churches did not have to comply, and yet I think churches are ones that were some of the first, where I saw ramps. That's another thing. Ramps and large print bulletins and Bibles and books. And another thing is crosswalks, audible crosswalks. I love those, audible crosswalks. The ones that talk to you, the ones that tell you, well, we have chirping in St. Louis, in some places, not all, but on campus. And then also, I like the ones that talk to you and say, you may now walk. You better stop. You're going to get hit by a car. I do know that for a while, 10 years ago actually, but for a while we lived in Irvine, California, and I was at the University of California, Irvine. And Irvine, apparently a few years before we were there, was one of the ADA cities. And so it was very accessible. But where we lived, I would get off a bus and walk across a busy street. was probably at least 4 lanes, I would say, 4 or 6 lanes. But there was a light, but I needed to walk across the street, and I never quite knew when because I couldn't see the light, so, which was a little dangerous. So I contacted, somebody said to me when I first moved there, they said, oh, you should contact the city because they will fix it. They are so good. They won this award. And I did. And within, I think it was the next day, someone was out putting an audible signal. No, this was what was interesting. Normally traditionally they would put an audible signal on the light. But because of where it was, they said we have a sound ordinance and we can't have the audible signal. But what we can do is do a vibration. So they put a vibration. When the light changed, the pole vibrated, and then they asked me to come out and check it out. And so I did. And so within, I would say, a week or so, I mean, they were right on it, and I had a tactile warning, the vibration, so that I could cross the street. That was amazing, and to see it that quickly. So those kinds of things definitely changed, and people wanted to improve those. Another thing that we offer at museums, and even we do with the Ability exhibit, is an audio tour. So when people cannot see an exhibit in a museum or an art, when you go to an art museum, and now we all use, it's not just people with disabilities, a lot of people want those audio tours. And I know, particularly when we were in Spain and France, I wanted that audio tour in English. So it's used for several reasons now, but at the beginning, for us anyway, for people with disabilities, it was used for people with visual disabilities. Then I think also many people have taken on more roles in disability education, disability services, and access. You'll see an ADA coordinator at a lot of universities. You'll see access coordinators, disability services offices, where it used to be one person wore many hats. Now, usually there will be someone who needs to, who the university hires to check documentation, verify documentation, provide accommodations to students. There have still been challenges with the ADA, or since the passage of the ADA, and those challenges are in several areas, but particularly in healthcare and in employment. And employment continues to be a challenge for people with disabilities. The unemployment rate in the United States has fallen under 6%, and yet the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is 70%. So still we are working on trying to get people with disabilities employed, but it's not that the people with disabilities don't want to be employed. It's helping employers understand that people with disabilities can do the job, are qualified individuals. And so that is another thing that people are definitely working on. So the law has led to many court cases that potentially will provide improvement and access. The other thing about the ADA celebration is a lot of celebrating is going on. And I was so happy that Fort Hays State University is celebrating the ADA and have invited us to be a part of that celebration. If you look on websites and you want to know what's going on in the country, there's the ADA Legacy Project, there's the ADA National Network, ADA.gov, and I know in our own city, in St. Louis, we're having an ADA celebration in October. One thing that we're having is the ADA Legacy Tour, and I don't know if that has come here. I have not seen it, but I believe it's coming to St. Louis, and on their website, it does tell where it's going to be throughout the country this year. And in the Legacy Tour, it has the Road to Freedom bus, and the actual bus will be there, along with photos from the disability movement, and as well as what we have in the ability exhibit is we have some of those photos from the disability movement. Another really good video that I would like to encourage you to watch is Lives Worth Living. And I show that in my classes, and it shows the disability movement, which is excellent. So one other way, well, there's several ways to become an ally. And so for us to move forward, we have the law, and the law is going strong. And I think a lot has changed over the past 25 years. But to move from the letter of the law to the spirit of the law, we can encourage others and educate our students to continue to be or learn to be allies. And that is really, I would say, the purpose of our projects, the Ability Institute at St. Louis University. And what we try to do in our work is to develop allies and just to get it on the radar. It's amazing, even after 25 years of the ADA and then the laws before that, that sometimes it's still not on the radar, and people tend not to think about disability. So if we can get it on the minds of people, that would be ideal. One way that we do that is through our own language. Attitudes, they say attitudes are the real disability. There are pins and slogans, that slogan is around. If attitudes show our behavior. So if we can change our attitudes through and show that through our language by using person-first language, inclusive language, putting people with disabilities first, and then that language itself is a more common, it would be a common language among people with disabilities and without disabilities, and it is more universally designed as well. So, and then avoiding words such as, if we think about normal. So we say people without disabilities are normal, people with disabilities must be abnormal, and which is not the case. So thinking about those kind of things, keeping that kind of language out of our conversation. Another word that college students use a great deal, well, I think a lot of people in even I've heard the younger students as well as older people use the word retarded in a negative term. And as whether you're talking about a person or just that situation. And so now there is a campaign, Spread the Word to End the Word, and that you can go online and pledge to end the word retarded. So keeping those things in mind as well. And if you go back to thinking about your person, I always like to do that. Keep going back to your person and think, well, has that person been excluded from anything? Should my person, the person I'm thinking of, should that person not be able to shop wherever he or she wants, in a large department store or a small boutique? Shouldn't they be able to eat wherever they want, whether it's a 5-star restaurant or a fast food establishment? Shouldn't they be able to attend amusement parks and museums and a Broadway play, or worship in a cathedral or a chapel, ride on a bus, a taxi, an excursion boat? Shouldn't your person, shouldn't all of us be able to have the opportunity that each and every one of us expect? Going to move on a little bit. According to Casey Powell and Summa, an ally is someone who believes they are equal to persons with and without disabilities, and they make a commitment to make change. So moving with that in mind, we can become allies for self-interest, for our own personal interest, to take care of someone we care about, love, maybe your person. We can become a self-advocate or an ally for altruism, where we We are focusing more on the big issue and not so much the person, where we're not including the person in that discussion, but we do want things to change. Or we can become an ally for social justice, where we are including the person with the disability in the discussion. And we're not so much thinking about how we look as an ally, but also how, well, we don't even think about how we look, but that we are looking to change the system by listening to the voices of people with disabilities. And I think you would agree that we would all want the person we're thinking of to be in that conversation. Not only be the voice for them, but allow them to have the voice as well. I learn from allies every day. Allies teach me, and most of those allies are my own students. Regardless of choosing to be an ally for individuals or a large systemic change, being an ally means more than a plaque on a door, or it means more than a verbal promise. One thing we are doing in the Ability Ally Initiative is asking you to take a pledge, and hopefully you did, and hopefully you all have a decal to put on your doors. But being an ally is an attitudinal position. It's a willingness to learn, and it takes action and commitment. So was I an ally at the age of 4? Who's to say? As I said, I don't think my mother would think of it that way. But if I think about it now, was I? Or do I strive to become an ally today? And do I ask others to do the same? Do I do my best not to exclude anyone from any activity? I sure try. I would like to thank you, Fort Hays State University community, for allowing Allies for Inclusion, the Ability Exhibit, and our Ability Ally Initiative to be here and to share with you. I'd like to thank you for letting me speak today, and I'd like to thank you all for being Allies for Inclusion. Here's to the 25th anniversary of the ADA, and to the next 25 years of inclusion, and to a future where human dignity is enhanced and people are accepted and valued. Thank you. I can if they have them, yeah. I would be happy to take any questions if you have questions.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
Bob Dole, one of the primary authors of the ADA, was just about 30 miles away from here. I heard several years after the passage of the ADA Act that he said there were unintended consequences from the Act. Some were positive, some were negative. What would you describe as positive and negative unintended consequences of the Act?
Unintended consequences of the Act, Americans with Disabilities Act. Well, definitely the intended consequences and the positive ones, I feel, are some of the things that I did mention regarding how much inclusion and acceptance has come about. And I think also just the awareness and on people's radar. So when you see a sign that is in Braille and raised lettering, I think those kind of things, or an audible crossing, those are things that are positive and encourage us to think about access. I think unintended, several things were a problem, people became angry about some of them. And I think when it came to requiring physical buildings or facilities to change, I know that people were concerned about that and the cost involved. So do I need to put in an elevator? Do I need to put in a ramp? Those things are quite expensive. When you look at employment, I think employers too felt, now I have to provide all these accommodations, and these are really expensive. So for example, one thing was, I know in my training back then, they talked about if you can have, why ask for the Cadillac if a Volkswagen will do? And so if people with disabilities are asking for particular accommodations, what does that mean? And particularly with employment, or even in colleges and universities. So again, I'm going to use myself as an example. When I went to a university and asked for a CCTV that cost at that time, I know it was over $1,000, maybe it was more than that. For some reason I have $2,500 in my mind, but that might have been my large screen computer. It was very expensive at the time. And so when I asked for that, or I felt as a person with a disability almost guilty for asking for that. And so then they would say, well, what else is possible? Can you use a hand magnifier instead of this big machine that's going to cost a lot? Or do we have to get that large screen computer, or can you just enlarge the font on there? So when I think of those things with employment and facilities, the cost really worried employers. And some of them would say, I don't have the money to do this, and I don't think I should have to do that. And so I would say that that would be one of those unintended to encourage access and inclusion. There were issues financially, and that caused, I know, some anger. Does that answer your question, sir? Is that yes? Yes. Okay. Okay. Is there anything else?
We have another question.
Okay.
So you mentioned earlier that there is some changes in air travel as far as disability access. I don't quite see that. Is there something like a big push for airlines, for example, or even airports? Maybe it's just I'm not paying attention to it, but I don't really see a big impact on as far as air travel.
Air travel. Okay.
I think it would be more for the elite members, or the ones that are Delta Sky Alliance members, or even older people, but I don't see where
I will tell you some of my own experiences in that I have noticed that things in airports have changed. Obviously, ramps and more electronic doors. I mean, I think we had those originally when you're talking about universal design. The doors in airports were accessible. I have noticed it more in the airport itself. Now, when I have been on airplanes, originally it was kind of interesting because I even, years ago when I first started this, I was a consultant at various companies for the ADA, and I would go in, and so I talked to some airline, well, actually we did a training for TWA. That's when TWA was around, and that tells you how long ago. And also, when I was on a plane, I would go and ask the flight attendants, have they seen changes, or what did they think? And it was interesting how they hadn't seen a lot of changes then. And when I was on a plane one time, I remember I went on first with the group with people with disabilities, and I had my white cane, and I sat in the first seat, and they were very kind and accommodating. And then that was during, I know this is way before some of your time, but they actually would bring by magazines, right? Would you care for a magazine? And so they saw me as blind, and yet they handed me a magazine. And they said, would you like a magazine? I said, oh, no, thank you. You know, I didn't say I can't read it, but I couldn't see it. But I thought that was interesting because they were very accommodating and kind, but then it still wasn't on the radar. So then when we did this training, we did a lot of physical, like just how to communicate, how to interact with people with disabilities on a plane. When you're talking about the width of an aisle or transferring from a wheelchair to the Aisle chair, thank you. And then transferring, I mean, that's still difficult. And I have had friends, I know, who use wheelchairs who then had to break down their wheelchairs and have them on the flight, and that they were broken during the flight. So you hear these stories, and that is unfortunate, and I don't have now that much experience with the airlines, but I personally have not seen a big change there other than the airports.
And I think part of that too is mostly because of the service for the airline but that's still about it.
Well, you can be an advocate for that. No, it is good. Anything else? Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.